Welcome to A People's Guide to Publishing, the vlogcast. I am your host, Joe Beal, the autistic publisher, and this is Elly Blue, the balancing voice of sane reason.
Today we're going to talk about fiction versus nonfiction. What are the differences and what are the similarities from a publisher's point of view? Joe, I know that you have some strong feelings about fiction.
Powerful. Did you know that all fiction is lies?
I mean, so other than fiction being lies and nonfiction hopefully being the truth, which,
When done well by a reputable publisher.
Let's talk about fact-checking for a minute. It's important to do it.
Here's a little backstory, dear viewer. So I wrote this book that I really should have a prop of handy, A People's Guide to Publishing. A lot of reviewers, and I use reviewers in the amateur sense of person who read the book and has an opinion, feels sort of disappointed that the book is, in their view, primarily about nonfiction. But I would push back and say that the book is actually about both. I guess let's start with the differences. Let's go.
Back when we talked about cover design, we also talked a little bit about title development. And some of the feedback we got from viewers, thank you for viewing and giving feedback, by the way. You can always hit like on that video or even hit subscribe if you want to get notified about more.
Pounding buttons is your job.
Some of the feedback we got was like, well, it's not as important to do that when you're talking about fiction. It's not as important to have the best cover and the best title. But I would say actually one big difference between fiction and nonfiction is that cover and title development are even more important in fiction.
Doubly so.
Because, like, how do you know what you're getting?
But let's look at why is that the case, which brings us to point number one. The biggest difference between fiction and nonfiction is there is a lot more fiction. One might say there is arguably to the tune of thousands of new fiction books published every day, which is a little bit staggering.
The market economics of that are very real. And if you publish fiction, you have to hustle hundreds of times as hard as if you publish nonfiction.
Things like credential matter so much more. You know, most people buy a fiction book because they, the same reasons they would buy a nonfiction book, but those reasons are hitting a lot heavier. Like, did they read a review? Did they see publisher's marketing copy in a place that they trust and or look for reputable information? Did they read a previous book by the same author that they enjoyed? Does this book contain endorsements, ideally on the cover, by an author that they trust, even if this author is not one they've heard of before? Does the cover clearly communicate what the value proposition of the book is? It's fiction, but like, is it historical fiction? Is it science fiction? Is it a mystery? It's like there's many kinds of fiction, and they should all have very specific descriptive covers.
And I would say this becomes even more so if you're talking about literary fiction, which is a much smaller niche with even greater competition than even genre fiction.
An even more crowded pool.
And then the cover really has to communicate this sort of artistic sensibility that also communicates what other literary fiction books it's like, and it's incredibly complicated. And I'm grateful that this is not our day-to-day because high stakes.
And it's a lot of flagging to be like, we're similar. This book is like that other book that you like by that other author you like, and that's why it's for you. The shocking thing about it all is that nobody knows what they're doing in publishing. Everybody has kind of variations on Imposter Syndrome. The tried and true ways of selling books are pretty in question for a lot of people, especially people that are really like trying to swim in a pool where it's too crowded for you to even like lie down and do like some basic strokes, because you really have to like stand on the floor, because if you get up you're going to bump into somebody else, and again I would point you right back to the like, when you publish a new book, and bear in mind there are 8,000 other books published today, July 31st, there are 8,000 more published on August 1st. Each one of those books to succeed has to displace a book from the same shelf in every bookstore to succeed. Whether that's a digital shelf, whether that's a physical shelf, it's, there's only so much attention span, so much space, there's only so much ability to hold people's attention.
So to summarize, fiction is different from nonfiction in that it's full of lies, there's more of it, and you have to work harder to succeed.
I mean, it's intentionally lies. I think everybody kind of knows. I don't think that one's going to, like, really... Well, I don't know.
Sometimes there are emotional truths communicated.
Controversy comes in weird places.
If you're publishing a bunch of nonfiction books and suddenly you publish a fiction book, you're going to have a really hard time selling that fiction book because you're essentially starting a whole new publishing company, because all of your relationships will be different, all of your marketing practices will be different, all of your, like, even sales people that you talk to and the buyers at bookstores will all be different people. So, and, you know, that's just as much true. Like, we published once a nature book, which is not something that we normally do, and we found it was almost like we had to start a whole new publishing company to publish that book, and we didn't really nail it because we didn't have the bandwidth. So when you're thinking about publishing books of different genres, whether, you know, within nonfiction or fiction, or like even crossing over that line, that's a big deal. And it's not like the work that you're doing isn't necessarily going to be different. We hope that you work just as hard at publishing your nonfiction as you do at your fiction, because that field is still really crowded. It's still really hard to succeed. But also consider, you know, it will get easier the more you do of it, so long as you stay consistent and true to yourself and keep working to develop relationships and connections and skills and knowledge in that niche that you are occupying as a publisher.
You know, the beef that people really like to pick with the People's Guide to Publishing book is they feel like the advice about how to reach readers does not apply to fiction. And again, I have to call hooey. Because you've reached readers the same way no matter what you're publishing. You reach them where they are hanging out at in their native environment, where they are comfortable, where they drink tea, where their cats hang out. You know, that's really all it is. I think it doesn't always feel intuitive to, you know, say go to a conference when you have written a fiction book. But that is because you haven't thought of the right conferences. You haven't thought of, like, where people want to read your children's book, where people want to read your novel. And again, the reason that so many, especially debut fiction books, have so much bigger marketing budgets is because they need to. You know, it's a crowded place. You know, that sort of, you know, people lean on, or by people I mean publishers, lean a bit more on author platform, if there is one. But again, even that doesn't really always translate. You'll have a lot of people that have a large platform, but their work doesn't translate to a book, or sometimes their audience just loves them on Instagram and doesn't want to read their book. You know, I mean, that's something that happens all the time. I think it's about thinking creatively. We had somebody at the National Bike Summit that debuted their children's picture book about riding a bicycle. It's full of lies, but it still hits that audience. That's still the people that want to read that book. People that come to us and say, like, oh, I just wrote this book. You know, what publishing conferences should I go to? And we're like, well, it doesn't really work that way. Like, it's kind of too late at that point. You know, you would need to have the book communicate the value through its cover, through its subtitle, through its title, to tell people why they want it. And just by supplanting yourself into those environments, it doesn't really make people want it in the same way. Like, a publishing conference is literally the most crowded place you can ever try to sell a book. It's the most competitive. It's not really a place where you're going to get new footing. It's not, you know, definitely there'll be people that will be excited about your work and about discovering new authors and buying books. But for the most part, you're bumping into people that are there for their own reasons and aren't necessarily having those reasons be buying your book. So I'd say go to a place where that is the case, you know. If you write historical fiction, you know, go to those conferences. You know, there's definitely historical conferences no matter what your specific subject matter is. You know, if you wrote a book about war, like, there's definitely a lot of veterans groups. You know, there's a lot of places that, you know, would excitedly be interested in what you're doing, you know, if it's clearly communicated by the book.
You do need to have a niche in mind when you write your book, or you won't find your people. I do see publishers and authors kind of focus on the quality of the writing and it's great to have high quality writing. It's great to have beautiful sentences, but there's not really a market niche for that except for other writers, and that is a very saturated market niche.
Mm-hmm. It's a great way to sell 20 books.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like...
And they'll love it.
Write beautiful, gorgeous sentences, but write them, like, about non-binary teenagers in space. That is a fiction book that I think you could sell really well.
Yeah.
That's a free tip for any of you out there. Or write them about, like, people who are really passionate about marine biology and environmental conservation, and then you will automatically have a way to reach those people, especially if you are one of them. You should be one of the people that you're trying to reach, right? Because you want to connect with a community of people who care about the same things you do passionately, and then it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction because you'll be able to reach them.
And I want to have a little shout out to a woman that got in touch with me after reading the book, who published a book about graffiti for children that was oddly something that hadn't really been done before. Those of us who have been at this for more than 10 years will certainly remember the absolute glut of graffiti books that came out. But this is sort of a new angle to put it into a children's story full of lies. And it's not for everybody, but no book is for everybody. It's more for the parents who grew up with those interests and values.
Thank you for watching our vlogcast. Please, drop us a comment or an email if you're feeling more shy.
Hit those likes and
hit subscribe.
Shares.
Tell us what topics you want us to cover. We would love to speak to your specific interests and needs.
But thank you for joining us once again on A People's Guide to Publishing, the vlogcast. I am your host, Chobiel, the autistic publisher, and this is Elly Blue, the sane voice of reason, and this is Ruby, the service dog, who has fallen asleep.